we're this different models of peace. What do we mean when we talk about peace? So we had the utopian peace model, we had the imperial peace model, which is the peace that, I'm in charge of. And peace of justice, and then there's the realistic peace, which is sort of a partial peace, right? And we're in the middle of looking at the texts in the readers on this unit, and we're dealing with texts about imperial peace, right? So we're up to number 5, which is on page 27 in your readers. But before we go into the next text, I want to note, I mentioned last time this model for ending the conflict, which is basically called the Israel victory, which means that the conflict will end, according to this model, the conflict will end when the Palestinians realize that Israel is there to stay and has won the conflict. And then you can talk about, what kind of independence they'll have and what kind of government they'll have and how things are going to work out between them. So I came across this article. I didn't make copies for everybody, but I think it's a very good statement of this approach to the conflict. I am not necessarily endorsing this approach, but I think it's important to understand. So the title of this is Why Shrinking the Conflict is Doomed to Failure, right? He refers in the beginning to this phrase, shrinking the conflict, as the shiny new slogan in Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy, right? And so he offers his critique to that. So I'm going to pass these around, and you can take a glance at them as we're going through. That is one set. It's 3 pages, so we'll take you too long.
JNS, what's JNS?
Jewish News Service, I think. Yeah. Okay, so back to the texts. We're on number 5. We're up to Maimonides. Okay, so let's take a look at this. All right, it's on page 27. And he says, Maimonides says,
What's an optional war?
a war that you're not obligated to fight, but you have reasons to fight. Right? So, for instance, you could make an argument that Israel should go into Gaza. I'm talking about not in the time of Maimonides. You could make an argument that Israel should go into Gaza, basically go in and hunt down all the criminals and take over Gaza again, right? And say, okay, we're in charge now. That is an example of an optional war. It is not a forbidden war in Jewish law, because after all, they're attacking you from there, right? It's not a commanded war, because who says that is, yes, thank you. Who says that is the actual solution to the problem? You can only make an argument for it. You can't prove it. Right? So, do this. No war, neither an optional war nor a commanded war, should be waged against anyone until they are offered peace. As it states, and this is the previous text we saw, when you approach a town to attack it, you shall offer it terms of peace. If they accepted peace and accepted on themselves to fulfill the 7 commandments that were commanded to Noah's descendants, In other words, the 7 laws that are supposed to apply to all human beings according to Jewish law, none of them should be killed. Rather, they should pay tribute. And again, it quotes the segment we just saw. If they agree to the tribute but do not accept servitude, or if they accept servitude but do not agree to the tribute, their offer should not be regarded until, and it's not accepted, until they accept both. Right? So, here you see again this version of imperial peace. Right? It is a peace that is imposed upon certain peoples. Right? Now, he modifies Deuteronomy chapter 20 just a little bit. And he doesn't talk about, taking booty and, not letting anyone remain alive. He doesn't deal with that, right? I'm sorry?
Servitude, what do you?
Servitude,
How does servitude?
meaning tribute. That's how he interprets it. He doesn't say they're all going to be your slaves. He says, you guys will pay extra taxes, just like any people that are conquered by someone else. So for instance,
But that's not what it says. It says if they agree to tribute, taxes, but do not accept servitude, they should not be regarded until they accept.
that servitude here doesn't mean slavery, it means being subservient to the Israelite nation. It doesn't mean that we're gonna take, this family over here and split it up, and this one will be a slave to this family and that one to another, it's not like that, right? I mean, Deuteronomy 20 seems pretty clear, people are gonna be enslaved, right? Or, it talks about, in Deuteronomy, it talks about forced labor, right? So that's pretty clear. Right? Maimonides doesn't even discuss that, okay? So, how do you think ideas about Jewish chosenness affect Maimonides' model? I mean, if you are God's chosen people, does that affect the way that Maimonides looks at this text?
I would think so.
You would think so?
Mhm.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because otherwise, what gives you the right to impose these kinds of terms? So that's another form of imperial peace. A little bit more gentle than the previous one from the Torah, but not exactly gentle.
Brian,
Yes, and
in the first paragraph, Maimonides gives a source text.
yes,
Then when he mentions Noah, it's Ibid 11, is that, that's referring
Yes.
to, I'm
Yes.
sorry, never mind, I see that now.
okay. All right, other questions or comments before we go on to the next one? Okay, so now we deal with texts that represent this idea of peace, of justice, all right? So here's Deuteronomy chapter 2, all right? There you go. This is where God is speaking to Moses, and Moses reports this as part of his farewell speech to the Jewish people. It says, "Arise, set out across the Wadi Arnon. I give into your power Sichon the Amorite, king of Heshbon and his land. Begin the occupation, engage him in battle. This day I begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the peoples everywhere under heaven, so that they shall tremble and quake because of you whenever they hear you mentioned." Right? And then I sent messengers from the wilderness of Chemo to King Sichon of Heshbon. Sounds, very poetic, right? With an offer of peace as follows: let me pass through your country. I will keep strictly to the highway, turning off neither to the right nor to the left. What food I eat, you will supply for money. What water I drink, you will furnish for money. Just let me pass through. As the descendants of Esau who dwell in Seir did for me, and the Moabites who dwell in Ar, that I may cross the Jordan into the land the Lord our God is giving us. But King Sichon of Heshbon refused to let us pass through. God had stiffened his will and hardened his heart in order to deliver him into your power, as is now the case. God said to me, see, I begin by placing Sichon and his land at your disposal. Begin the occupation, take possession of his land. Right? So how does the offer of peace here differ from what you saw in Deuteronomy 20?
I was kind of dictating.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 20 was kind of dictating, right? It says, we're here, we're in charge. This is, okay, all we're asking is, let us buy food and water. We're just passing through. Yes, Ryan.
Why would God harden the king's heart? What would be the advantage of that? Why?
Then we get their land.
That's just to get the land.
Yeah. Does that sound good?
Yes.
Want a bigger house?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, on the first one, it's presented as if the enemy has a choice as to whether to accept or not accept the two conditions. And here, as Ronnie just said, God is forcing them to do something that makes it legal for the Jews to take over the land.
Yeah.
He is acting on,
Mhm.
God is inserting himself in history
Yeah.
here and not
Yes.
in the first one.
However, at least theoretically, it is possible for them to avoid any kind of war, right? They, what does it really mean when the Torah says God hardened someone's heart? Like Pharaoh, right? So, you've given that to our Torah probably, Daniel. Yeah? What does that mean? Is it fair to punish Pharaoh because God hardened his heart? No, not necessarily, right? What I think it means very often is that people get addicted to a certain approach to certain affairs, right? If you're the Pharaoh, you're addicted to being a god, to having everyone treat you as a god. You don't negotiate anything, right?
You're addicted to power.
You're addicted to power. And maybe the same thing is true here. King Sichon says, I'll let anybody through here. We don't do that. No. We're not interested in selling you food and water. Stay away. Well, no. So, not a very neighborly approach. Right? But that's, how many leaders become.
Boycott. It's like a boycott, not really a boycott.
Yeah,
It's not really a boycott.
let's boycott the Jews. How's that gonna work out? Yeah. Other comments or questions here? And so how does this tie into the ideal vision of peace in the Bible? If they would have theoretically just, allowed the Jews to pass through and buy food and water, it'll be like normal relations. We're here, you're there, this is our land, this is your land, and we're just gonna have normal relations.
The only one to pass through once.
Sorry?
The only one to pass through once.
You're the only one to pass through once, so,
Once,
yeah, big deal. But that would have been a whole different model for relations, right? That's sort of the peace of justice, where you have, let's say, economic relations between countries, right? And they actually get along. Yeah, Karen.
But if they say no, you end up at the same point, right? Somebody's gonna assert their will on the other,
Yes,
so you're having some niceties ahead of time, but don't you end up at the same place? If you're gonna take their land, you're gonna take it in war, that's what we do, right?
that's what happened,
Right,
right?
that's what happens today, right?
Well, sometimes, right? No, so to take an analogy today, European countries buy gas from Russia, right? That's not that they enjoy doing business with Russia, but it's like, winter is coming, right? So you buy the gas, right? Do they have a choice? Well, theoretically they do, but maybe realistically they don't. Right? So hopefully you develop other choices in the long run. Right? Here, this is a one-shot deal. Either do business with us or don't. And here are the consequences if you don't. Right? But at least, theoretically, that's a model for a just peace, where you have an economic relationship, you have a respectful relationship, you're on your side of the fence, we're on our side of the fence, and we don't attack each other.
So that's the Abraham Accords.
That's the Abraham Accords. Right? And we acknowledge the rights of the other people. That's the key thing, that, we're always, Israel is always waiting for Arab nations to come around to that point where they accept the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. They accept the reality of it. Whether they like it or not is immaterial, as long as they accept it. Yeah.
But if you need the gas, like Europe needs the gas and they go to Russia and Russia says no, or if there's no one other than Russia, I mean, you said if they said no, you could go somewhere else, but if no one else will let you buy their gas, and I mean, Jews often have limited choices, not with buying gas, but in terms of land and historically.
Yeah. Well, it's not that Russia doesn't want to sell the gas. They do.
Right, we don't want to do business.
But it gives them good leverage. Yeah.
I don't know my geography.
So you join the club.
No, I just want to know, would there have been another way for the Israelites to enter the land of Canaan without having to deal with this?
Probably would have had to deal with worse. Yeah.
That's what-
How far around are you prepared to go?
I don't know, like I said, I don't know.
Yeah.
my geography.
Yeah.
Kingdoms.
Okay, so I'm not very good at drawing maps, so I'm not gonna try that.
I think there's a map of it.
But just take my word for it that was the best option. Yeah. Okay, number 7. So this is from the Midrash Rabbi. And of course, the Midrash takes different interpretations of biblical verses. Okay, so for instance, Israel sent messengers, right? And you have to bear with the Midrash here because it's a little convoluted. I'm going to read it and then ask questions about it. Okay? Israel sent messengers. That's the scriptural piece where it says in Numbers that they sent. Okay? This bears on what Scripture says, and he quotes a verse from Psalms: trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and cherish faithfulness. It also says, another psalm, depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. Now, the Torah did not insist we should actually go in pursuit of the commandments. In other words, to go out of your way to put yourself in a situation where you could fulfill a commandment. But it said, if a bird's nest happens to be before you, right? This is the mitzvah of returning of not taking the egg from the nest of the mother bird when the mother bird is there, right? So, I mean, you know, how often do you come across the opportunity to fulfill that mitzvah today, right? You have eggs in your trees at home? Probably not, right? But if you did, then you would fulfill the mitzvah, right? You know, if you meet your enemy's ox, right? Another mitzvah. You know, if you don't meet the ox, then there's no responsibility that you have, right? You don't have to go out of your way to meet your enemy's ox. If you see his ass, right? You know, he loses his donkey. So, yeah, I know what you mean. So, I've had those kinds of negotiations. So, you know, you see his donkey. If you don't see his donkey, you have no obligation to return it. Right? When you beat your olive tree, right? If you don't own an olive tree, you don't have to go out of the way to fulfill a mitzvah which involves setting aside a certain amount of it. Right? When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, or when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, if you don't come into your neighbor's vineyard, you have no obligation. Right? In all these cases, if they come your way, you are commanded to perform the duties connected with them, but you need not go in pursuit of them. In the case of peace, however, seek peace where you happen to be and pursue it if it is elsewhere. Israel, in fact, acted in this way, although the Holy One, blessed be, had said to them, begin to possess it, the land, and contend with him in battle. They pursued peace. Israel actually sent messengers to Sihon and said, let me pass through your land. Right? Now, another piece, another exposition of the text, you know, so saying Israel, this is one of the three things said by Moses to God, to which God replied, you have taught me something, right? That's not in the Torah, that's in the Midrash itself. And the third occasion of those three was when the Holy One said to him, make war with Sihon. Even though he does not seek to interfere with you, you have to open hostilities against him, as it says, and so on and so forth, and contend with him in battle. Moses, however, did not do so, but in accordance with what is written lower down, sent messengers. The Holy One said to him, by your life, I will cancel my own words and confirm yours. Why? Because you went out of your way to seek peace. Right? When you draw near into a city to fight against it, then proclaim peace unto it. It was only after Sihon did not accept their overtures that the Holy One cast him down before them and made it possible for them to, you know, overrun. Right? So, here, you know, what is Moses' offer of peace? Is it a form of rebelling against God? Or is it a fulfillment of the law? That's the way they want to look at it here.
Which way, what did you say?
It's a fulfillment of the law.
So it's like if we offer the Palestinians to enter into peace conferences and they totally refuse, is that kind of relate to this?
Well, the real question is, what if they don't refuse, right? If they don't refuse, then, you know, you have an obligation to sit down with him and to pursue peace. If they don't choose to sit down and discuss it,
That's what I meant, yeah.
then, you know, you have a variety of choices, but you're not obligated to keep begging them, right? And maybe even you have, you know, a certain amount of discretion in, you know, kind of pushing them towards peace, right? So here, you know, the rabbis kind of take Moses' behavior and they reread it into an ideal that God approves of, right? Seek peace and pursue it, right? Go even farther than what God asks of you. Right? Comments or questions up to here?
I actually have.
Please, Ryan.
I wrote this down, so I'm not sure if I got this right. I wrote down when we started discussing this, that under the peace of justice, that everyone's rights are preserved. Now, it doesn't sound that way when you read through this. It sounds more like they would become a captive nation under the rules of the Israelites. Their rights would not be preserved. Did I write this down?
But that's not true of Sichon.
So they went through, they attacked, and then they said, okay, and now you may do whatever they go back to doing whatever you do before.
It's only because Sichon refused, normal relations with them.
Okay,
Refused
okay.
passage. It's like, certain countries don't allow Israel to use their airspace,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? That's called abnormal relations. Right? Here, they're just asking for the right to pass through.
Didn't Saudi Arabia allow it? Was that for just a one-time thing?
Well, it was at least a one-time thing.
Yeah.
We don't know if they're actually allowing a lot more now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
A lot is being done under the table, and they
That's
don't
correct.
want people to know.
Yes, because they'll decide when it's the right time for people to know. Yeah. Okay, number 8. Here we go back all the way to Genesis 13, right? From Egypt, Avram went up into the Negev with his wife and all he possessed, together with Lot. Avram was very rich in cattle, silver, and gold. He proceeded by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel, the place where his tent had been formerly between Bethel and Ai, the site of the altar he had built there at first, where Avram invoked the Lord by name. Lot, who went with Avram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so the land could not support them staying together. Their possessions were so great, they could not remain together, and there was quarreling, etc., etc. Right? The Canaanites and Perizzites were then dwelling in the land, and Avram said to Lot, let's not fight, right? We're kinsmen. Here we got the whole land before us. You go north, or I'll go south. You go south, I'll go north. And Lot looks and he says, the whole plain of the Jordan, this is before Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed, it's pretty good land. It's like the garden of the Lord, right? So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan, and he journeyed eastward. They parted from each other. Avram remained in Canaan. Lot settled in the cities of the plain. Well, we know about the inhabitants of Sodom, right? So God says to Avram, raise your eyes, look out from where you are to the north and south, east and west. I give all the land that you see, you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, as if one could count the dust of the earth, and so your offspring too will be counted. So walk about the land through its length and its breadth, for I give it to you. Okay? So what does this story say about coexistence?
It's possible, yeah.
Possible. And not only do Avram and Lot coexist with each other, family, right? But they also seem to coexist with everybody else there. Right?
Aren't these two guys kind of negotiating to split up land that's not necessarily theirs to begin with?
Not clear.
Yeah.
Not clear. Apparently, there's a lot of
There's other
land
tribes.
available. Right? Now, later on, we do see that Abraham has to buy a burial plot for Sarah and for the family. Right? But that doesn't seem to affect what's going on here. Here, it's kind of about coexistence.
What if Lot got kicked out of Sodom and didn't have, would Abraham have taken?
Well,
back?
actually, that happened. right? Remember that, there's a war that is fought over those cities, and Lot is captured, and so Abraham puts together a little army, and they retake that area and free, his nephew.
So he stays there.
So, the good guys are always the ones on the side of peace, right? That's how it's supposed to be, isn't it? It's a different approach from what you see with Moses even in Deuteronomy 2, let alone Deuteronomy 20, right? So this is much more about the just peace, right? Where everybody has relations, everybody gets along, mostly. Hopefully, right? Yeah, there's still an element of hope in that, right? Sometimes more hope than reality, but that's the idea, right? So now, the last model, non-utopian peace, right? Number 9, right? So here's the prophecy of Zechariah, right? Word of the Lord of hosts came to me, and thus said the Lord of hosts, I am very jealous for Zion. I am fiercely jealous for her. I have returned to Zion. I will dwell in Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be called the city of faithfulness, the mount of the Lord of hosts, the holy mount. By the way, Zechariah prophesies after the destruction of the first temple, and it's before the rebuilding of the temple. So this is like, a prophecy about how things will be. Right? There shall yet be old men and women in the squares of Jerusalem, each with staff in hand because of their great age. In other words, people will live long and prosper. Right? And the squares of this city shall be crowded with boys and girls playing in the squares. Though it will seem impossible to the remnant of this people in those days, shall it also be impossible to me, declares the Lord of hosts. In other words, you might think this is a fairy tale, because you're living in exile, you're in oppression, whatever, right? But God can make it happen, right? I will rescue my people from the lands of the east and from the lands of the west, and I will bring them home to dwell in Jerusalem. They shall be my people, and I will be their God in truth and sincerity. Take courage, you who now hear these words, which the prophet spoke when the foundations were laid for the rebuilding of the temple, the house of the Lord, right? Now, this is a different vision of peace than the one we saw in Isaiah, the Messianic peace. This is kind of a getting by peace, right? You get to go back to Jerusalem, right? You get to have, a degree of independence. It's not like, you conquer all the surrounding nations, right? And it's not like there's automatically going to be peace forever, right? So it's not a utopian vision of peace, right? It's just you get to go back, right? Now, how does this vision of peace relate to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Because of the biblical, because God gave it to us, gave the land to us originally.
Okay, which doesn't negate the possibility of other people living there in peace too, as happened with the original.
But he specifically says where the temple is and the mount. And the mount becomes a little problematic.
Well, yeah, right? So that, I don't think it really be, people there, the Israeli leadership themselves are very worried about keeping certain people in line, because there are extremists who would love to blow up the Dome of the Rock,
Right, but
because they think that that's going to lead to a messianic situation. It's more likely to lead to World War III. If you think you can force the coming of the Messiah, good luck to you. Yeah.
I have taglines to try to understand each one of these four. For utopian peace, I have no war. For imperial peace, I have the peace that comes with victory. Are there similar taglines that I might put next to peace of justice and non-utopian? Just as a like 3-word summary of what they mean? I can't come up with mine.
Well, I think for non-utopian peace, the tagline would be more difficult. It'd be a little longer than that. I'd have to explain it as an imperfect peace.
Imperfect peace. I like
A
that.
starting point, at least.
I put
Yeah,
down
the-
realistic.
A realistic peace, right? Meaning, not everyone in the world is gonna love it, but we're gonna have it.
That's excellent. What about the peace of justice?
So peace of justice would be
We can work it out.
long-term coexistence. Maybe.
So none of these are really the status quo today between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Correct, because they're technically still in a state of war,
Right.
even though, it doesn't flare up every day. And I saw a thing online this morning, and somebody from Hamas came in and
Yeah, I
shot
saw that
somebody.
too.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, so, one person was killed, right? So that's just, evidence that the conflict continues, right? Which nobody is surprised at, right? Because Hamas will be the last ones to give up, on the war, right? The PA is not necessarily giving up on the war either, but they're much more pragmatic about it. They're willing to wait for whatever they think the right moment is. And they're not in the strongest position right now among their own people. So, got to see how that works out. Okay, other comments or questions up to this point? Okay, let's see how many of these videos we can get in, Jennifer. This first one is excellent. One of the best in this, you're gonna see in
Is
the
this
class.
for
This is-
section 5?
Yeah,
I'd
no,
like
no,
to
no,
see
this is still
that.
section, this is still unit 4,
Oh,
and this
okay.
is the one, Yossi Klein Halevi, okay?
Yossi, thank you for being here. Pleasure. Yossi, what for you is the essence of peace, of the kind of peace we're hoping to achieve one day?
The very fact that I'm pausing and I don't have a ready answer for you is indicative of how remote peace feels today. How we've allowed our hopes for peace to wither, and that really depresses me.
Can peace, in that reality, can peace even be a Jewish value? What are we talking about when we use the words of peace, but the reality we see is so different?
I'm worried about my inability to answer your question readily. And I'm worried about what is happening to us as a society that feels that peace is not just unattainable, but on some level, the word peace itself for many Israelis has become a kind of subtle threat. And I saw it happen during the period of the suicide bombings in the early 2000s, and I felt it too. That every time I would hear the Israeli left speak about peace while the suicide bombings were happening, I wanted to scream and said, "This, you've sold us an illusion, a dangerous illusion." And one of the things I personally find it hardest to forgive Yasser Arafat for is that he turned the word peace into something suspect for so many of us.
So when you hear American Jews, particularly liberal American Jews, speak about peace in a way that you don't always hear in Israel today, at least, how does that make you feel?
American Jews remind us that peace is not a political issue, but an aspiration. It's the essence of who we are. It's one of the names of God. It's our being, and being caught in what I do believe is an existential threat with no credible partners on the other side creates a kind of cynicism and despair that is deeply damaging to us spiritually. It's damaging to me.
You know, Yossi, you're angry at Arafat. You're kind of angry at people who seem to have turned peace into almost a threat in a way, or speak about it from a distance without understanding, as you feel, the reality of Israel's predicament. But are you angry at yourself at all?
Oh, very much.
Why?
I'm angry at myself for giving us an easy out, for not challenging myself over and over again about the complacency with which I've come to live with the occupation, and which most of us have. And I know what the occupation looks like from the inside. I was a soldier. I served in Gaza in the refugee camps during the first Intifada, and I came out of that experience desperate for peace. And partly what you're hearing is this sense of we were fooled. We were played for fools. And one of the things that I believe very deeply about what it means to be a Jew in this time is, and what it means to be a post-Holocaust Jew, is that we're forbidden to be naive, and we're forbidden to be brutal. And the tragedy of this conflict is that we have been both. And so, you know, there was this great line from the 60s band, The Who, "We won't get fooled again." That became, in some sense, the mantra of the Israeli public after the collapse of the Oslo process.
And Yossi,
but it's not enough. And this is to answer your question, Tal. That's not enough. It's not enough to say we won't get fooled again, because you're still not dealing with the brutality of the occupation. You're not dealing with what it does for me, living with the wall, and in Jerusalem it is a wall, literally outside of my window. I wake up in the morning and there's the wall, and I've absorbed the wall into my daily life. I've come to accept it. I've come to accept the fact that on the next hill, my neighbors can't come into Jerusalem, can't visit their families. There's the wall. And it's become as much a part of the landscape as the Judean desert out just beyond.
You know, Yossi, you're presenting a very worrying picture. You worry a lot yourself, it sounds like. And it seems to me as if you're saying cynicism and worry are their own kind of problem. And
yes, it's a spiritual sickness.
Yeah, and how can we begin to emerge from that?
Look, I can tell you how I try to deal with this, and that is by trying to maintain a relationship with those Muslims who are ready to have a relationship with me, whether it's Muslim citizens of Israel or Muslims from abroad, and to force myself to hear their narrative, and to force them to hear my narrative. So I can't make peace at the negotiating table. I'm not there. But what I need to continuously force myself to do is make a place inside of my being for the counter-narrative. Not for their sake, for my sake, to keep me alive spiritually.
So inside Yossi Klein Halevi, despite all these worries, is a little bit of hope?
Look, for sure. You know, I'm old enough to remember Anwar Sadat getting off a plane at Ben Gurion Airport and waiting for him on the tarmac is Menachem Begin. Now, we've gotten used to Sadat Begin as the unlikely team of peacemakers. But if you think about it for a moment, 4 years before Sadat comes to Israel, he launches a preemptive strike on Yom Kippur. He's the most hated man in Israel, responsible for the deaths of 3,000 soldiers. Menachem Begin is elected a few months before Sadat shows up, and is the most right-wing prime minister that Israel ever had until that time. And this is the dynamic duo that brings peace. It's so extraordinary that you have to believe in the possibility of the miraculous here.
The unimaginable is possible.
The unimaginable in the Middle East is likely. and we know that usually is bad news, but sometimes we can be surprised by the miraculous.
Yossi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your reaction?
If you try to take the Sadat Begin picture and paste it on top of players now, you've got Bennett, who's an Orthodox Jew,
Netanyahu.
and nobody on the other side. There is no Sadat for us to no matter how bad. Who in here can name the leader of Hamas? I know I can't.
Okay, well, I wouldn't say there is
Mohammed
no
Sunni.
one on the other side.
I'm sorry.
I wouldn't say there's no one on the other side. I mean, you're seeing it in the Sunni nations among Arab countries, and you're also seeing it within Israel. So for instance, Mansour Abbas, who is the leader of the Arab Party in Israel, who is now part of the coalition that is ruling Israel, right? That's certainly someone to talk with, all right? Someone who condemns violence on both sides. Right? So never say there's no one to talk to when there are people you're already talking to, okay? Now, some of those talks are sotto voce, right? They don't, we said it before, you know, it's not the stuff that we hear about in the news because it's not time for them to make it public yet. They'll know when it's time for them to do that, right? But the fact that this guy and his party are in the ruling coalition in Israel, it's a game changer. It may not be the salvation of Israel in the end, right? But it's a step, and it's a game changer.
What is his relationship to the Palestinians in terms of either Hamas or the PA or?
Well, he has some relations with folks on the other side of the border, right? So, and while he does not endorse violence on either side or any side, he, he has contact with people even in Hamas, and certainly within the PA. Right? He wants change in Israel, but he is not endorsing an elimination of a Jewish state. He understands, what some of the limits are. And he wants to get what he can get for his people, right? So that's someone you can work with, and they are. He and Bennett may not turn out to be best buddies. That might be a stretch, but they're at least talking.
I think it's fair to say, though, Sadat spoke for Egypt. I don't know.
Sadat was a dictator. They still have dictators in Egypt, right? But yes, he did.
Who in Gaza and who for the Palestinians in the occupied territories in Gaza speaks with that level of gravitas, that level of authority?
Well, nobody really. And you know, Muhammad Abbas is what, in his 16th year of a 4-year term? As head of the
Also,
PA?
years old.
Yeah.
Something like that. And Hamas, you know, who knows? Some of the leaders of Hamas are in Qatar. So, you know, and they're not ready to talk about accepting the right of a Jewish state to exist. They're just not there. And it's not clear that the PA is there either. You know, because, you know, they don't educate their children as if they're talking about a future with a Jewish state.
Correct.
Of course, we have to remember Sadat was murdered.
Understood, right? Sadat took a big risk to do that. And that's probably why King Hussein didn't follow up until 94. So, and you know, in Jordan, the leadership is very, you know, low key about it. And they'll criticize Israel once in a while, right? They'll, you know, but it's more like chicken scratches than it is anything else. So,
And we saw what happened to Rabin.
well, and,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, so we have our own problems in Israel, right? You know, because you know, here's the guy who went to Oslo and shook the hand of Yasser Arafat, and didn't live to see the next steps. Okay, so you know, he talks a little bit about how peace has become a very difficult word in Israel, right? Because with the disillusionment after Oslo and the you know, the intifadas and you know, the constant rejectionism against the state of Israel, there's this feeling that we don't have a partner for peace. We don't have anybody to talk to for peace. So what do? Yeah.
And what would you say about the people, like particularly the ultra-Orthodox, who really are not for peace at all?
That's not necessarily true. Among the Haredim, there are many people who, you know, they say, you know, if the government thinks we can do business with someone, we'll do business with someone. They're not unhappy about the Abraham Accords, for instance. They're fine with that. What you have to deal with is not necessarily the Haredim, but the nationalist elements in Israel, the greater Israel movement, which says we never will give back a single inch of, you know, the land on this side of the Jordan. And that, you know, because that involves a huge number of Palestinians, you know, it's not sustainable if you want to maintain Israel as a democracy. To annex those people and then say, well, the Palestinians can't vote. You know, how's that going to work out? Yeah. Let's see if we can fit in one more.
Suzanne, thanks for being with me.
I'm glad to be here.
Suzanne, what do you think the place of peace is within the current American Jewish discourse?
Well, I think it's bifurcated. I think that most American Jews are talking about justice and not peace. But I do think there's a significant conversation about peace among young people. And I think that's a conversation that is not only confined to American Jews. There is a preoccupation with the idea of peace among young people. And so the discourse of American Jews takes on that flavor. American youth has grown up in a very privileged position. And they've also grown up in an era which has a very utopian idea about what the world can look like. And it's the human rights movement, and particularly the discourse around the human rights movement, is a vision of a world in which all differences have been overcome. All humans are responsible for one another, even without states. And along with that is the notion that the world can really be at peace with one another.
So you're describing young people talking about this utopian peace, and I feel like in Israel there's this like strong criticism that you sometimes hear directed towards that kind of version of peace, about how disconnected from reality it is, how it doesn't understand the Middle East.
Well, it may not understand the Middle East. It also may not understand many parts of the world, not just the Middle East. Yes, it may be disconnected, but at the same time, it is a beautiful vision, and it shouldn't be rejected. It needs to be understood to be an aspiration and not something that is a demand for every present moment.
Talk a bit more about that. What is the place of what you might call naive utopianism? What can it actually contribute?
I think it can contribute by orienting you towards thinking about the future. And when you think about the future and you have hope for the future, you can begin to imagine other ways of doing things, as long as you keep very distinct the idea of insistence on it happening now.
Right. So, I mean, you're kind of saying that naivety is dangerous on the one hand, but at the same time, it enables you to imagine a different future. Do you think Israeli Jews can connect to that?
I hope that they can connect to that, because I think a little bit of it to counter some of what is an understandable Israeli fatigue is a wonderful thing.
So American Jews can perhaps provide Israeli Jews with a bit of energy.
Yes.
A bit of a vision that things can be different.
That things can be different and that they can begin to hope.
Suzanne, let me ask you one more question, a personal one. What's the kind of peace you hope for?
When I think about peace, I think about it in terms of end of conflict. And I prefer to see, in general, I would prefer it if we had a little bit more conversation and talk that was ratcheted down and that thought about the idea of end of conflict rather than utopian peace.
But end of conflict sounds utopian today as well, no?
Maybe so, but at least I think that's something, maybe not end of conflict, minimizing the conflict, making it possible for people to live their lives in a relatively normal way. That seems to me to be the kind of language that we need. Language of peace, at least in the North American context, as much as I have defended just a few moments ago, the idea that it's good to have a vision of the possibilities of peace, it walks a very fine line, because those that really become excited by that idea also tend to think that it has to happen now. And if it doesn't happen now, they get very disappointed.
They give up.
And they give up.
And so, in a way, what you're saying, if I'm understanding you, is that sometimes being a bit more practical or even modest about peace enables you to be more hopeful about it as well.
Exactly.
All right, Suzanne, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It seems that all of those different pieces are all part of a utopian peace.
Steps maybe in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, a utopian peace would encompass all of those others, the imperial, the just, the everything we've talked about.
Eventually. And I think that's one of the things here, the problem with utopian peace is people want it now.
Yeah.
And if the world's not ready for it, then it becomes the peace of the lion eating the lamb.
But utopia has to be a definition that all the parties agree on, right?
Which
Good luck.
hasn't happened yet. Yeah.
And another thing, I really disagree with something she said at the very beginning. Of course, who am I? But she said young people are interested in peace. And I think the young people are interested in justice. I mean, in this country, that's all you hear is justice, justice, justice.
Yeah, I think she almost uses those words interchangeably.
Okay,
You know, that, you know, the kind of peace that people want, the reason they want it is because they see that as justice.
as justice.
Yeah. So, you know, land, state for the Palestinians, you know, long-term, that is justice. And I think, you know, again, most Jews would like to see that unless they believe that it, you know, it's just not gonna happen. Because that element will never accept a Jewish state. Right? That has other problems with it, of course. So we deal with that. But yeah, this notion of an insistence on wanting to have peace now, without necessarily accepting the very real problems in front of that. That's what bothers me about many progressives today. Right? I mean, we all want progress, right? You know, that's why it's called progressive. Fine, you know, but that's not what you're gonna get in the end. If you want that before people are ready to settle for justice for everyone. Okay, we're at the end of our time right now. We'll take a little break and then come back.